Welcome. We're talking about the release of the 2023 Real Estate Almanac Organized Real Estate section with Clint Skutkin, Senior Vice President of Organized Real Estate Consulting at T360. And I'm Paul Hagee, Editor-in-Chief at T360. And we just came out with Organized Real Estate report today of the Real Estate Almanac. And there's a lot of information and data in there. And it comes out every February. We rank the nation's largest MLSs by year-end membership count and local realtor associations by year-end membership count and state association. So Clint, thanks for being here. I know it's a big process. I've seen the data that you've gathered and shared and dissected, and I would love for you to talk a little bit about the methodology and how we're able to track all this data and kind of organize it in a way that we can actually present it.
Yeah, thanks for doing the deep dive on this. It's been a passion project now. I think we're going on about 5 years of trying to distill the data. And as you know and have seen over the last couple of years, we just keep being able to drill further and further in, which is great. When we initially started this work, and thanks to our friends over at RESO, they're great partners on this. We collaborate with them throughout the year. But when we first started this a few years ago, it was really a cleanup process, right? And I always love this story of here we are talking about multiple listing services and associations where we pride ourselves on having accurate, timely, and relevant data, and yet when we ask the question how many MLSs were there, no one could tell us 5 years ago. And even today there's some confusion around that, but we're getting clearer and clearer by the year, getting more and more refined in terms of finding all the details and the different levels. So it's been fun to kind of see it all come together, and each year as we progress to be able to dig into these things. But yeah, a lot of bringing together of multiple databases. You have the association-based databases, you have MLS-related databases, and thankfully, RESO with their unique identifier allows us to bring the association databases together with the MLS databases into a singularity, which is really important because understanding the landscape, there's a lot of relational aspects between the association and the MLS. What type of association is it? What type of MLS is it? So having that's really, really been great to bring it all together over the years.
And when I show the website in a second, we kind of walk people through the website. We'll show exactly how that plays out in the data for the first time this year, because we were able to tie these together and show which regional MLSs, like how many associations they serve, and then which each association, which if they are part of a regional MLS, which one they're a part of. That's just amazing data. I mean, it's like really, really valuable. And so anyhow, so let's go. I think now it'd be good to just run through the site and kind of give people like an orientation of what of what this is, because it's more than meets the eye, and it's a little bit hard to grasp at first glance. But so here's the overview page, and the way this is organized is we have we call it organized real estate, which is composed as a definition of MLSs and local realtor associations and state realtor associations. And this year we've organized them also and ranked them by their 9 census subregions, the MLSs and the local realtor associations, which I think is fascinating there. Maybe talk a little bit about like how the impact of that, because MLSs and local realtor associations, it's really a geographic kind of narrow field that they play in.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we were talking about. Initially we're just trying to identify the organizations and place them where they were, at a national scale. And each year, as we've gotten cleaner about this, we've been able to drill down into it. Last year we introduced the census regions, and especially around MLS this year, digging even further down beyond just the census regional level into these geographic locations that are much more localized, as you point out. And just the level of intelligence. We know there's a great deal of disparity between the largest of the large MLSs that are in excess of 100,000 and the smallest that you can count on 2 hands in some instances, literally. And so to know that on a national scale is interesting, but to then be able to break that down into census regions and then even further into what really are fairly common marketplace areas, and then see the differentiation just just within, a given area. So yeah, I think these drill down opportunities, create more intelligence, and again, take this list from just being a flat line, who's got how many folks to where are they, and how do they juxtaposition.
Yeah, like for example, and this is the South Atlantic region. These match up with the 9 census quote unquote divisions, and we had that data, so we were able to show it in, and it just kind of just shows you like who's really dominating in some of these regions, and as these MLSs get bigger and bigger, where they start, which ones may start really gaining the gravity of a particular region. And it's just, we're starting to be able to pull the data out and maybe create some visualizations, I imagine, in the future. This is one example. Of course, I know we grapple with some of this. It's like some of these span outside of these natural divisions, like Bright MLS is like one. It probably bleeds into New England a little bit, and or another divisions. But for the most part, they're pretty, they fall within the divisions pretty nicely. But you can see this is the South Atlantic region. This includes, these states here: Delaware, Florida, Georgia. Kind of where this map that covers.
Which, by the way, this region in particular, or this area, has a number of the top 10 MLSs in the country. And last year, as we started digging in on this, we were trying to understand. We knew there was movement around in terms of market, and did that reflect in the MLS subscriber counts? And what we did see is that they were. The southern regions were gaining at nearly a 20% rate, whereas some of the western areas were gaining at about an 8% rate. So this is an interesting one where you have some of the largest entities gathered and grouped together, but as you drill into some of the others, you have like a really, really large, and then there's a huge gap between the top and the next couple down, and even here you can see that disparity. But it's kind of cool, and ultimately, this isn't necessarily we're celebrating or saying somebody did something to make this occur. It's a reflection of the marketplace. But again, when you stack this up against the overall industry landscape, and we can talk more about this later about how do you utilize this data, and I don't think it's to necessarily celebrate, oh, this one's bigger than that one. It's rather to see how it is reflected in what's happening in the marketplace, and how does that get reflected back into the brokerage and in the actual marketplace itself, and home purchases, and where
that's a good point, Clint. It's like, and we'll get into more specifics about what the utility of all this is, because this is a lot of descriptive elements here. There's not a value judgment, but it does show data in a way that allows you to see where opportunities are, and where maybe things are naturally heading, and which ones which organizations are kind of doing things and growing, and which ones may not be, and which ones you may want to partner with. And there's just a lot of opportunity to uncover in the state. And that's kind of why we do this at T360, so we know what's what. To your point, like you mentioned, we'll get to this top level data in a few slides, or in a second. But like, how many MLSs there are, how many realtor associations are, and like to a point, like look at Bright MLS at the top. You can see how many associations are served by the MLS, and each tile has that data, which is very, I mean, I know for me, it's like, as I've come to know this data over the last few years working with you, Clint, that's so compelling and interesting. And then the fact that it's a regional MLS, and the difference between regional MLS and local MLS, and in our STR chapter you and I did together, those have real meaning and real implications for the evolution of MLS and associations and all, the whole industry, really.
Yeah, the relational aspect that we kind of started with, understanding that, for those that are inside, like myself, that spend time in organized real estate thinking association and MLS, it really helps us to understand the constructs of what's going on there. But for those that are outside looking in, especially as, we see brokerages consolidating and being pulled into one of these areas or the other, and not understanding like, oh, I'm going from this local association MLS where I just went down to the office, and, there was the same people dealing with my problems one way or the other, whether it was association activity or an MLS activity unit. So now I've been pulled into this other one that's got 43 other entities that they're trying to serve. And, now I've got a satellite office, and the association folks are being trained on MLS. They aren't necessarily MLS experts. And how do you get that handoff? So yeah, in terms of, brokers and agents understanding how this impacts their day to day, these relational aspects do matter.
Yeah. And you can see like here, 14 in this, the South Atlantic, Naples Area Board of Realtors, it's a local MLS. So it's an association that essentially runs its own MLS. That's not, we'll get into the details a little bit later of like the definitions of local MLS and regional MLS and the implications, but like that's that's a valuable piece of information when you're trying to evaluate what does this mean and where does this fit into the size relative to the others in the region. So let's go to local realtor associations. Um, this is the local realtor association data, and this is for the nation. This is not by this view is not by the region. We also have the regions, of course. And one of the things I'd love to call out is like we can show which ones if they're a part of a regional MLS, which one they're a part of, and which is very, really valuable. And if they're a local MLS, we give the name of the local MLS. And usually sometimes it's the same name as the association, because you well know, the associations essentially run the MLS in a local MLS scenario. So, I just love this. This is another pulling the thread on the relational data we've been able to uncover thanks to your diligent work over the last couple of years.
Probably a good point to clarify now, how we kind of, and there are always, exceptions to the rule here. So we're doing our best to categorize these in a way that you can see them in an amalgamated way, because that's really the overall kind of market intelligence. But, a regional MLS for us is either constructed in a way that has multiple stakeholders, multiple associations, or it might serve a variety of actual marketplaces as a single entity. So you saw a couple of folks there at the top end of that, HAR, and Miami are a couple of the largest associations who also happen to run their own MLS that provides services into outlying areas and have absorbed other associations, and then of course MLS related services. So there's a bit of a blend here, but in general, when we say local MLS, it's an association run MLS that has almost an MLS kind of committee capacity to it. There's some business structures that are there, LLC versus C6 nonprofit things. But at the end of the day, their decision making is blended more closely when they're in a local association than what you would see in a regional association where you have multiple stakeholders or multiple markets that you have to serve.
And we're starting to see that, and we cover this in the Trends Report article, and we'll do some additional analysis based on this. The 2023 Trends Report article that you and I did together. It's like in the regional MLSs, like because of there's a governance structure to you were getting at that's different, that allows them a little bit more. They tend to be a little bit more business minded, and they have a little bit more freedom and ability, and sometimes resources, because they're usually larger, to do some of these innovative things. So you can see that some of the largest MLSs are, and this, we're on the MLS stage. We can go back to the multiple listing service, like California. The two largest ones in the nation are doing, they're doing Nestfully, which is the consumer facing listing site. They've done Redistribute with the new data monetization. So there's some, this is to our point of calling out what the difference is between these MLSs. There's some real distinctions there.
Yeah, and what you'll see is largely a 2-to-1 kind of ratio. So the 2-to-1 ratio in number of folks served at the top level, where California Regional is just on 110,000. The largest association in Miami serves about 55,000. So there's kind of that 2-to-1 ratio and componentry there. So it's kind of interesting when you look at the association related membership. It's interesting, those who are in an association only entity that's served by regional MLS, that makes up 60% of all of the associations out there. And in terms of the actual membership, it's 1.21 million of the 1.7 million. So the vast majority of folks are now being serviced in an association only environment that then have the regional MLS providing those MLS related services. And so that's really interesting. When you look at that, there's different breakdowns in terms of the average size of an entity, which is much larger than the median size, because we have so many small entities. When you break that out, association only, the median there is 526. The average is 100 or 1,089. And then when you look at association MLSs that are combined, that goes down to a median of right around 300 and an average of 814. So again, this 2-to-1 ratio almost applies in terms of the different types that you see. So interesting data there, and again, different approaches, different business structures, as you mentioned, and a lot of times different marketplaces that they're serving with a variety of needs.
And this is some of the top level data. Aside from that, we have the raw data kind of presented in the in the website, but we have some data we pull out based on all the database work we have, and we can see that the MLS number of MLS associations, like there's a clear trend, like the number are going down, and the average subscriber count is going up. So they're getting fewer and they're getting larger. I think one of the things that's interesting is, as we noted in the website, even, it's like the regional MLSs stayed the same. I think over the last few years, it's really the smaller MLSs that are starting to they're struggling to provide some of the services you and I have talked a lot about. It's like the consumer demand, and also the technology requirements, and also the revenue required to kind of stay up to speed. Do you anticipate like maybe more consolidations of regional, or where do you see that headed?
Yeah, what's funny, because when you put this information out, everybody always goes into I've had more consolidation conversations today than on most days around this information. And frankly, while we're seeing a decline in the number of organizations, I don't think we're seeing the level of significance. I think you point out in the report somewhere that, we haven't seen the number of regional MLSs growing. So it's not that we have, small or medium or common sized local MLSs coming together to form more regionals, and that condensing. What we're seeing is, typically medium to small and micro association MLSs that are combined now joining up and being absorbed into a regional MLS that's already established. And so this is that pain point where, and I've had this conversation several times today, well, is there more coming? Is it going to accelerate? And I don't know that there is, because where most of the pain points and where the obvious change in membership or association and MLS counts would make the most difference are in those marketplaces that have grown together. It's either those suburban areas that have grown into the major metro, or the metro's grown into it, or a couple of small communities that have expanded and now are essentially one community, making up a larger area. But those are still served by these local association MLSs and or a regional MLS that was formed from a really smaller grouping. And it just gets very difficult when you've gone through that process, or you feel like you have an established
history meeting like the future at once, because like these exclusive territories, they kind of, they worked in they individually, and now like in Zillow and Redfin and all these companies, and like as it gets national, real estate is national, to the point of there's been a lot of effort over the years to make a national listing databases. That's a natural, like for MLSs, and like there's Broker Public Portal, there's Nestle is kind of the new flavor, and there's HomeSnap and like all these others that are really trying. And then we have like Zillow and these others that are by default like a national listing site.
Yeah, and the thing that we know is that these naturally occurring marketplaces don't go back and reference any our chartered areas from the early 1900s and say, okay, this is where we're going to provide our services, and this is our market, and we won't go any further. That's really that conflicting aspect of these marketplaces that weren't there, that are now emerging, are causing a lot of the competitive aspects in the organized real estate space. And so where we're not seeing consolidation as much, we're seeing more and more direct competition. And so I think that's where you see a lot of these collaboratives coming together. It's what we call, they're creating a compilation album. You're old enough to remember this. Remember, we used to get all the great singles, all the best songs in a single album. That's a lot of what's going on here, where you're collaborating, you're bringing the best together, putting it in one place. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that you deliver all that. By partnering, you're able to now collaborate to compete. So they're compilating. And so we're seeing this repeatedly over and over again, where these market areas have come together.
Yeah, and we've talked about this a little bit, but there's like a lot of innovation around the nature of collaboration and like the different structures that it takes. There's like the charters, and at some point we should catalog all of these pieces. There's a lot of different flavors to this. Like we've cataloged the MLS collaborations as well. Like there's MLS Align, there's MLS Grid, and we cover those in the chapter. But it's also like the association collaborations that are coming in a lot of different flavors, it seems. Right. Like,
yeah, I've definitely seen more of that, where again, they're wanting to have that community scale representation that the association presents value, especially through advocacy, but they're also wanting to be able to do more than what they maybe can. And again, when you're basically half the scale of what these large MLSs that are collaborating to get more done, it makes sense that the associations would follow suit to try and get to scale and do things that are still unique and representative of their communities, but again, allows them maybe to do more than what they could do on their own.
Yeah. Okay. So you're in the world, as you were saying. It's like if you look at this data all the time, you're talking to people all the time, it's hard to tell like what's happening or what's, I mean, what's happening, but it's hard to see the difference when it's changing so slowly over time. I want to ask you to step back just a little bit. Where do you think, if 5 years from now, if you had to say, like, what are some of these numbers looking like as far as number of MLSs and average number of subscribers served? Same thing with associations. Like if you had to say now, we're not going to hold you to it. We know a lot of things change, but just where do you think it's headed?
Well, there's some bifurcation, I think, in front of us in terms of, we've talked about the largest being larger and the small being small. That's one way to look at it. But if you look at the various marketplaces that have emerged over the last few years, again, remember, association MLS is very much a reflection of the marketplaces, economics, all those aspects that are coming into it. I think there are still going to be growth markets, right? Like that push through all of the, rate impacts and, those types of things. Where I live in northern Colorado, we're still seeing price increases and still, so there are going to be these pockets of communities that are served by usually the more progressive and larger MLSs and associations that I think will continue to see, either incremental growth or holding service. What I think in some of our state level data starts to be the canary in the coal mine here is that I think there are going to be some outlying areas, some markets that are going to have more of an immediate impact from the economic shifts that are occurring. And then that's going to follow suit and I think really lend itself to, some of the impacts on subscriber counts and member counts. Because remember, it's not just about consolidation that impacts the average, member count or subscriber count. We've been seeing 3 straight years of growth, and again, when you look at it at a macro level, like through the state lens, you've seen this, 3 years worth of everybody, all the states, accelerating and going up. And this year, for the first time, we see a few of those folks showing up in the red. And if you look at some of those areas that are showing up in the red, I think those are those indicators of those who maybe don't have as much of an insulated marketplace. So anytime there is an economic or a market shift, then it impacts the number of folks that are in the business. And they're more sensitive to that. So I think you're going to see a balance of that. And ultimately, a tapering down, I think, is just realistic when you look at the member and subscriber counts that we've seen versus the sales activity that we've seen. It has to normalize at some point and come back down. Historic is historic for a reason, and it is not the norm. So we're going to
all know it's a cycle. Real estate is, if nothing else.
Well, I didn't know. We might know that, but there are about 60% of folks out there in many instances in associations and in MLSs that have never experienced that as agents and as brokers. So they're new to all this. So yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna come back to and ask the TLDR question. In 5 years, if you had to say ballpark, what's the number of local associations, realtor associations?
Yeah, I don't think it's the realtor association numbers change much at all. I think there's still a need to have that local communal kind of representation. Where we are seeing changes specific to associations, a lot of those have moved into a chapter format amongst larger associations. So they almost still have that local connectivity. And in an association capacity, that's needed. I mean, associations are communal in nature. They have a really heavy value proposition in advocacy. And that means having connectivity to the community, having relationships, having an understanding and ability to vocalize.
That's an important insight, and I think that's the innovation there around, because that's the federated structure of NAR, and like there's a role for that local, and it's easy to get lost sometimes when you're thinking about the small. And we've talked about, you and I've talked a lot about this over the years. Is like, the associations sometimes can lose sight of some of that core value and focus when they're running the MLS and like trying to scramble and like focus on that, because there's revenue and there's also a very clear need, but it's kind of a separate function, and okay, same question for MLSs 5 years. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you continue to see some incremental, decreases, a lot of absorption like we've been talking about it. I don't see a ton of consolidation that, expedites this. We're seeing more of a trend towards data sharing. Again, it's not about the number of organizations at the end of the day in an MLS capacity. In many instances, it's about bringing the data together to allow, those who do sell across various MLS service areas to be able to see that as a singularity, just as many of their clients do through the various portals, and to reduce the duplication of entry, to reduce the duplication of subscribers paying in, to be in multiple entities. And so, some of those pain points are starting to drive conversations back into this idea of data sharing as a different mechanism than maybe it was being utilized 10 and 15 years ago, where it was kind of a, well, let's stave off that consolidation by utilizing this. I think now folks are saying that if we can bring the data together, we can provide value and service level capacity by doing that. It doesn't need to erode us as an entity. It means that we can facilitate that while still existing.
You've said this consistently over the last couple of years when you and I talk about this, because there was consolidation, was like there was the beat of the drum, like it seems like 5 or 6 years ago. It's like, oh, it's coming. But then and you said it's consistent. It's like there's this collaboration thing that's happening and changing, and like that's kind of the future of how these organizations achieve the economies of scale, where they can start unlocking new revenue and new efficiencies and that type of thing. So I think it's like it's pretty consistent. So and you would you would know. So I think it's really interesting. Okay, we release all this data, we release the website, and we're gonna put some more analysis on top of this and more visualizations. There's a lot to mine on this data, and we've just scratched the surface. We just have the data out there now. What should brokers know? What are some of the takeaways from, like, we got this release? What are some of the things that they can use or take away from this data or use it in some way for their businesses?
Yeah, I think the main thing that I would stress is understanding the landscape and holding the decision makers who are acting on your behalf accountable to really fulfill either their core services as an association or their core competencies as an MLS, and to really push them to not continue this blended view of what an association and an MLS is, in terms of the services being the same as the competencies. And there's a slight difference there, but they're very significant in terms of knowing your lane and really sticking to it and being diligent about delivering against those things that add the most value for members of an association versus what adds the most value for a subscriber of an MLS. And I think brokers need to be vocal about, the accountability back into that. And you can only really do that when you understand the relationship and the business structure of your association and MLSs. So I think that's one place I would start. And then the additional pieces is starting to understand as you're expanding or maybe you're consolidating as a broker, and your marketplace is different than it was, and your agents that you have underneath you are in different communities and in different MLSs or associations than they once were. It's just being able to relate to and convey the need to bring together the data. Even if it doesn't mean consolidation of the entities, the consolidated data, creating a marketplace that's far more consistent, far more accurate, far more timely in terms of what the agent capacities are, rather than this dependence on the outside environment, even gray data, where it's being scraped and people are solving for problems outside of the associations and MLSs because they want that data together. So I think from a broker standpoint, especially if you're a leading broker voice in your community, emphasizing, at the end of the day, you need to make decisions for the marketplace, for the consumers to some degree, certainly for the agents and the brokers, and be thinking through that lens and not be thinking about protecting my revenue, my value proposition as an entity. Because at the end of the day, if we don't serve the marketplace, whether that be through the brokers and the agents, or even ultimately the consumer, that's how you get disintermediated, I think, as an organized real estate group.
I think, and you bring up a good point in, like, about brokers too. It's like you and I both know it's like they have a lot of influence and power. I know it's hard to kind of, they're busy running their own businesses and trying to survive, but like they have a big role to play in help shaping where this heads and where
well, and I would flip this on the other side, because this is another thing that I see on organized real estate, is back into the brokers. Like, when you are engaging or you're thinking through, also be thinking in that market-based activity, not like, oh, I'm protecting my business model or I'm protecting my market share, because then that just begats that same type of, well, okay, well, that's great. You're thinking for the brokerage, I'm thinking for the association and the MLS. And in the meantime, the consumer is getting squeezed and they're looking for other solutions outside of us.
It's easy to say it's so hard, and it's so hard to because like focus on the consumer. I think we both would agree, like, that's the long-term win, and like whoever's really, really unlocking that. But I can imagine there's a natural challenge of, like, the organizations still have, they're like, okay, how do we meet revenue? How do we grow and figure out how to collaborate, which is what we're talking about. Okay, what numbers are you really watching to see how things change within this space? Like what numbers are, what data points are saying, okay, I'm watching this. If I see this start changing, this just means that something is afoot, something big is shifting.
Yeah, I think, because we just saw a little bit into the future with some of the downshifting in terms of number of subscribers and members in certain portions of the country through the second half of last year, a full year of going through this normalization cycle, watching those membership and subscriber numbers and seeing how much of a market correction there is there. And what that's ultimately going to mean for decision makers. The reason that's so important in my space is because organized real estate, although brokerage, this extends out into that same consideration, we're such a headcount dependent model that if we start to see those indicators of that changing, it really drives us towards understanding, what are those additional opportunities to diversify from a revenue standpoint. And, for brokers, we've seen them going more towards ancillary services and those types of activities. For associations and MLSs, this is where the advent of some of these collaboratives at a national scale that are bringing data together, transactional data, all these other pieces as an amalgamated scale, and trying to define what the value of that is, creates a significant opportunity to diversify and even potentially then share back, as the RE Distribute model kind of demonstrates. Of if you're contributing to this, we want to make sure that you're participating in this, and we can create revenue opportunities outside of just trying to get more people into the industry, right? Like we've all been driven by more people into the industry means more revenue for an MLS, means more revenue for an association, means more revenue for a brokerage.
I think the subtext of what you're saying, and I think we probably both agree, it's like there are efficiencies, and within efficiency is also more streamlined, less people, and like who knows where this what the future holds, but like I think that there's an element of that where that potentially this is headed, which I think, depends on how things evolve. But I think.
Well, I would say, I think the membership counts, again, beyond just what it means internally, externally. I think those are indicators about which marketplaces long term are have more stability to them in a changing economic and market environment. So, from an investment standpoint, from the way the market overall functions, these are indicators. This is what I was saying earlier. Like, look at the conglomerated data in terms of organized real estate against what you're seeing in the marketplaces. Those are the intelligence pieces that at an industry scale we can apply this type of a list and help us all better understand, what's going on out there, and prepare and be realistic about our marketplaces and how we may or may not be impacted by the shifts that are occurring.
Great. Well, Clint, thank you for the time. Thanks for helping us. Thank you for walking through with us the data and the release. It's a lot of work. It's great collaborating with you and getting us out there, and looking forward to more. And everybody who's watching now, hopefully visit realestatealmanac.com. You can see the data there, and there's tons to go through, and stay tuned. We'll be doing some more analysis and do some data visualizations, and thank you. Thanks, Clint.
Appreciate it. Have a great day.